Let's send a very strong message to Governor Walker. Let's show Governor Walker that his voter suppression efforts will not work.
Ahead of the Wisconsin primary on Tuesday, Bernie Sanders has repeatedly criticized Wisconsin Republican Governor Scott Walker for voter suppression efforts, specifically for signing a law requiring voters in the state to show photo identification when they go to the polls.
It has never occurred to me, not for 1 second, to try to figure out a way to keep people from voting because they might be voting against me.
But according to Scott Walker, Sanders has it all wrong.
So we make it easy to vote. You can vote same-day voter registration. You just got to have that voter ID along with. But we also make it hard to cheat, and that's the difference. You should look at the facts.
All right, let's look at the facts. There's the fact that despite dire warnings of voter fraud, a Wisconsin federal district court judge ruled that the law's defenders, and I'm quoting here, could not point to a single instance of known voter impersonation occurring in Wisconsin at any time in the recent past. Not one. And the fact that, as Hayes Berman writes in The Nation, the law could block 300,000 registered voters from the polls. That's 9% of the electorate, with voters of color and student voters disproportionately affected. Already, people are being forced to stand in long lines to cast early ballots in Wisconsin, thanks in part to the voter ID requirement. And the problem is only expected to be worse on Election Day on Tuesday. And just this morning, on the final day of early voting, the statewide voter registration system crashed, causing delays in voting. There are also reports that people couldn't get ID cards at the DMV during the outage. The ID cards, of course, they needed to vote. Joining me now, Hayes Berman, senior writer at The Nation and author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Tell me about this Wisconsin law. Why do you think it's problematic?
Well, it's a really bad situation. We saw the 5-hour lines in Arizona. That caught a lot of people by surprise. This is more like a slow-building hurricane, which is we know it's coming, but now that it's here, it's really bad. 300,000 registered voters, as you mentioned, don't have a government-issued ID. There's a clear racial disparity. Blacks and Hispanics are 2 to 3 times as likely to not have that ID. Students are impacted because most universities and colleges, you can't use your student ID to vote, so they have to issue separate IDs, which is a whole process for students. Then there are people.
So a student in Madison at the University of Wisconsin or in Spring Green can't just use their student ID to vote?
No. I mean,
even though that's a state entity, obviously, that knows who that person is and where they live.
The Wisconsin legislature wrote the rules so that you needed a signature and a 2-year expiration date, knowing that no student IDs had that. So thus, University of Wisconsin-Madison has to print different IDs for their 43,000 students to be able to vote in this primary and then in November.
This seems one of those cases in which it's a pure power play. Like the argument about voter fraud seems to have been sort of definitively lost. I mean, there's been sort of empirical study after empirical study after empirical study. You could read court filings. You can have, you know, in Kansas, they commissioned, right, a big investigation. They come up with a dozen or 5 examples or 3 examples here. And yet it doesn't seem to matter because it's not really about persuasion.
Well, this was about power in the first place. I mean, Republicans took power in 2010, and they were determined to keep it. And this is how they're trying to keep power. They didn't present a single case of voter impersonation in court. They didn't even try to present evidence of voter fraud. They just keep saying it so much that people think it's real. But if you look at in Wisconsin, it's not just voter ID. They've cut early voting on nights and weekends. They've made it harder to register voters. They've made it harder to be a resident of the state in the first place to be able to vote. You have to live there a longer period of time now than you did before to be able to vote. All of these things combine to really be a perfect storm of voter suppression in Wisconsin.
Do you think we'll see problems on Tuesday itself that might actually, like we saw in Arizona, provide some sort of trigger for reform in the interim between what happens in the primary and the general?
We could. I mean, the only good thing that came of the 5-hour lines in Arizona is it made everyone wake up to the fact that the Voting Rights Act was good. These are the kind of problems we're going to see as a result of this. I hope that we don't see this, but we're already seeing cases. I've already written about cases in Wisconsin and many other places, people who don't have IDs. They just can't vote on Tuesday. It's not a question. They could wait 5 hours. They still won't be able to vote. They're not showing up on Tuesday. Other people will show up. They think they'll be able to vote, but we don't know if their votes will count. We don't know if they have the right ID. There's lots of problems that could potentially be on Tuesday and then obviously in November.